Hi, Jen. This is Mike Jabot from SUNY Fredonia. I'm a U.S. partner, and sort of my day job is working with pre-service teachers about how they can use GLOBE and other inquiry-based science strategies in their classrooms, and then do a lot of outreach around GLOBE with teachers out in classrooms across our region. So pretty lucky guy. I've taught you a little bit about the question formulation technique, and kind of we're really excited about the impact it's having with the teachers. So thanks for the opportunity to talk through this a little bit. So everything that I'm using today, a PowerPoint that I modified, came from the Right Question Institute. So for anybody that's interested in more resources, including this PowerPoint and some ideas, if you just Google Right Question Institute, the materials are there, free of charge. They ask you to create an account, but it's just to give you the opportunity to be able to communicate with other people that have sort of common interests. So basically the idea behind the question formulation protocol is to help students to use their questions. So kind of the idea that on average a teacher asks about 200 questions in an instructional period, and a student asks about 2 questions. And so the question formulation technique is a really nice way, from my opinion, to sort of flip that around. The questions can be used in lots of different ways, conducting research, helping them design experiments, projects across the board, all which I think are at the heart of the next generation science standards, and how we hope that our future scientists will have been trained in K-12 about the processes of science. And they also serve really well for the Science Research Symposium. So sort of briefly, what happens along this is the components. So the very first piece is something called a question focus or a Q focus, and I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. There are rules for producing questions that the students need to follow, or we ask them to follow. Then the students are producing questions. We ask them to categorize questions, and you'll see an example of that. And then once they've categorized the questions as a group, first a small group and then maybe as a whole class group, they prioritize those questions, sort of decide on what their next steps are going to be, and then sort of reflect a little bit on the whole process. So a Q focus is a simple statement. It can be a visual. Actually, the example I show in just a second will be a visual. Something that causes a question to be generated in the students' minds. So the most important part is that it really should be created from the curriculum content. So one of the concerns that I think practicing teachers have shared with me is the whole idea about, it's kind of a scary thing. You're sort of flipping the classroom, maybe an overused term, but you're flipping the classroom over, and the students are generating their own questions. But what I tell them is that you're still in charge. So this is one of the examples of where you really are in control. So picking that Q focus that's based on the curriculum content that you want them to think deeply about is where it starts. You do need to have a different Q focus every time you use the question formulation technique. So what you wouldn't want to do is have them generate a set of questions and then come back with the same Q focus. Sort of defeats the purpose of doing that. So what the Q focus, first of all, it should be brief. So you're going to see a really brief example in just a second. And it should be a little bit provocative, I guess, or at least stimulate their thinking about what's going on. Really can't be a question, and I hope by the time we're done with this you'll understand why, but asking questions about the question would sort of derail the process a little bit. And so just a little tip that came from the Right Question Institute, sort of use that criteria when you're thinking about your Q focus. So to design your Q focus, define the purpose of it. So the example that I'm going to share aligns well with work that we could do in land cover, one of the GLOBE protocols, and so you'll see that. Kind of thinking about what you would like the students to do with the questions they produce. So again, what the hope would be is that this Q focus would give them some questions that when we went out in the field to do the land cover protocols, they could be trying to use that experience to answer those questions. The idea that you'll see there are lots of possibilities for these questions, so there's more than one idea that comes from this. And I hope that when you look at this, the criteria of it being based on curriculum and being pretty short, you'll see that as the example. So here's a Q focus that we use for land cover. It says these leaves came off the same white oak. It's obvious that the shape of their leaves is very different. So for you as a teacher, you kind of know this phenomenon is dealing with something called sun leaves and shade leaves, and it is driven by where in the tree these leaves grow. And so lots of questions could come out of this from students. And I think for the most part, out in the field, if you have white oak trees, but it's also true in the other trees, they could collect data, so sort of building into that claims, evidence, and reasoning sort of model that we hope we're using. They could certainly collect evidence that can help them support their reasoning and making a claim. So then some pretty simple rules for producing questions. And you would do this with kids prior to giving them that Q focus. So really simple rules. You tell them to ask as many questions as they can. They're not to stop to answer, judge, or discuss the questions at all. Whoever's recording the question should write down every question exactly as it's stated. So don't edit the question as you put it down. And if instead of a question it's a statement, then that's really the only editing you do. So change that statement into a question. If you're on the Right Question Institute, sort of the tip about posting the rules or putting the rules in, what they have is really almost a half sheet of paper that has the rules on it. And every desk in my lab or every desk when we're out in classrooms, we have a copy of those questions so that the students don't have to, they have these rules to be able to go back and look at. So ask the students to review the rules. This, I will tell you, this review process gets shorter and shorter the more you use it, but initially it's important for them to be able to ask questions about the rules. And I think what has worked well with the teachers and with the students in their classrooms is to ask them to think what's difficult about following those rules, and just sort of being very open about the fact that this is a very different process. And then asking them also, is there one of the rules that they think will be the most difficult to follow? And probably the question or the rule that's the hardest to follow is that whole one about writing things down exactly as they were said. So, and again, a couple more tips in our PowerPoint about how to do that. And then the students produce the questions. So divide the students into groups. 3 to 5 seems to work well. You get beyond 5, then you have some hitchhikers who don't necessarily participate. I found, because I've tried a smaller group, I've tried pairs, and the pairs didn't work well either. There just isn't enough. I think some questions get generated based on the questions that other students within the small group are asking. So with 2, it's really pretty difficult. One person has to be the note taker, so you only want one person writing down the questions. And you can sort of use a strategy. I try to do a spinner, so if we have 4 people in a group, I spin, and hopefully it isn't always the same person who's asked to be the recorder. And then using big sheets of paper works really well, or in my case, I have large whiteboards that are individual whiteboards that the students use. So you want something big So they have lots of room to be able to write lots of questions. Show them the Q focus, and then remind them, produce as many questions as you can in the time that you've been given. Make sure they follow the rules, and it helps if they number the questions as they go along. It helps you when you'll see at the end when you sort of ask them to report out. It helps that you're able to identify a number. And then the tip, it's also important that the note taker is also contributing questions, so that you don't get somebody who feels they have questions that don't make the list or things like that. So once you've done that, they've gone through the process, generated as many questions as they can, the next piece is to categorize the questions. So they're going to go through and look at all the questions that they generated, and they're going to identify them as either being a close-ended question, which can be answered yes or no or a one-word answer, or open-ended questions that require more explanation, or we need to collect data to be able to answer that question. So the first thing you ask them to do is just go through, and I usually, using the whiteboards, I usually ask them to switch up to a different color than they use to write their questions, and mark the questions as either being closed or open. Now, this will be a good discussion within the groups, because there is some discussion about whether a question is really closed or really open. I try to encourage the students, the teachers, to still don't edit your question. Have that discussion, come to a group consensus about whether it's closed or open, and then mark it. So pretty straightforward task. Take the time to ask the students the advantages of closed-ended questions, and then also the disadvantages of closed-ended questions. So for us, you kind of know that what the advantages and disadvantages are, but it's a pretty good conversation with students. Again, I think this is just like having to go over the rules so specifically. The more you use this, so right now at this time of the year, we're not using step 2 much with the teachers or with the students that have been using QFT, because they kind of know what the advantages and disadvantages are. And you do the same that you did with closed-ended questions, you do with open-ended questions. And it's really important for them to understand that you're not making a judgment about the quality of questions, that both kinds of questions are really important. And there are times if we had only open-ended questions, we wouldn't be able to make much progress, but having some open-ended questions is what sort of drives us. I think probably the most important thing about this is helping them understand that as scientists don't ask questions about things that they know, or things that are really sort of very, very focused. They always are looking to ask questions that stretch their understanding, stretch their knowledge, and that's sort of where the open-ended questions lead us. Then what you're going to ask them to do is they're going to change questions from one type to another. So kind of a good rule, at least initially to start, is to ask them to take one closed-ended question and change it to an open-ended question, and one open-ended and change it to a closed-ended. And just there's a tip on the slide, but another tip I would give you is in using the whiteboards, I ask them to switch to a third color of marker when they do this. So it's pretty obvious what their original question was, and now what did they change to make it open, what did they change to make it closed. Then now they've got this whole list of questions. 2 of the questions now have been modified to change their form, and now what we ask them to do is to prioritize their questions. So there's some criteria, and you can, again, you're sort of leading the discussion, facilitating the discussion. So sort of what you want them to do to prioritize, you can sort of shape the conversation around this. But some criteria that might work about prioritizing as a group, questions that are really of interest to them, questions that they think are the most important to answer, maybe questions that are going to help them design an experiment or project or solve a problem. And also on that prioritizing questions is, are there questions that they feel that they would need to answer first in order to move the conversation? All right. So that's prioritizing. You ask them pretty simple task, just put an X next to the questions, 3 questions on this slide, but 3 questions is a pretty good set of questions, pretty good number of questions to ask them to prioritize. So they just mark those with an X, all right? And it doesn't hurt to remind them about what the Q focus was. So that's another advantage of having the rules either posted in the room or on these little cards that are with them, because you can just put the Q focus back up instead of having to have rules up or something being projected. Now what you're going to ask them to do is to share this with first within their group, and then I always ask the groups to share with the other groups. Why did they choose those as the most important? Ask them about the sequence of questions. So an example, what numbers are your priority questions? And so now they share out, first of all, what the 2 questions that they modified, their open-ended question and their close-ended question. So tell us what the original question was, tell us what the new question is. They share out their 3 priority questions, their reasoning for their prioritized questions. And then if there is a sequence, and sometimes there isn't a sequence to the questions within the group, share that though if there is a sequence. They report out and the sequence of questions are produced, and what they'll notice, the idea, the tip of sort of paying attention to the numbers of the priority questions, what they'll start to notice is that oftentimes the first questions they asked don't end up being the questions that they put as their priority questions. And that's a great thing for them to realize, that part of this question formulation is the fact that they were sharing their ideas, and by sharing those ideas, new questions got generated. So just something to think about. And so that was sort of the end of my PowerPoint. I apologize, I hit enter too quick. One other thing that I would remind, so back to the teachers being, not 100% sure about this until they try it, is as they're reporting out, what I always try to do is open up a word processing document or a new PowerPoint slide, and as they put out their questions that each group has prioritized, I put those questions up. So we've recorded those sort of as our classroom set of questions. And they may, within their group, have prioritized questions, but after we're all done with everybody reporting out, we can also have sort of a group think about, off our class list now of questions, are there questions that we feel we should try to answer first? It's been an incredible success from my perspective in terms of getting, flipping sort of that role of questions in the classroom. I've had teachers say, what happens if a student, don't they feel badly if their question doesn't make the list of prioritized questions? You know, we've been out in doing something in the field, and the student will say that they found the answer to their question. Even though it didn't make the list, they still have their own personal questions. So it's been really, really a very, for lack of a better word, a very cool process. So, does that make sense, Jen?
That was great. Thank you so much for sharing, Mike.
Oh, and one giant breath. I don't think I took a second breath.
I have one quick question.
Absolutely.
When you have the list that's generated from that, what is it, a Q focus, right? Mm-hmm. Is your goal sometimes to answer the question for the Q focus, or is it the starting point, or is it something that you may answer as a teacher, but then it's been used as a prompt for more investigation? Yeah,
no, that's a great question. I don't think I've ever directly answered the question that was around the Q focus. I think in the past we've used things like essential questions, and so I try to think about the Q focus questions as almost being essential questions. And my definition of essential question is a question where the answer, a student's answer to that question changes based on the experiences they've had. And so maybe the leaf example is not a great example of that, but the idea behind it is, you're going to find, at the bottom of a tree, a leaf has a greater surface area because it's fighting to get that light that's traveling from the top of the tree down to the bottom. And so sort of having the questions that they generated, but also having sort of maybe keeping that Q focus where they can see it is kind of the way we've handled it. And I think that goes back again. I mean, the Q, you're still in charge. You want them to be their questions, but you kind of know the big picture and kind of know where you're going with it. So I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, you did. So thank you. And thank you again for your time.